Minister, what happens come Christmas time?
Very good question. I mean, the council ministers have been looking at this already, and we've been quite clear at the start of this in March, when we had to lock down the borders and restrict travel even for residents trying to come back. That was quite an extreme reaction to a very extreme situation we were in. We're now in a much better situation in terms of the testing capability on the island, the track and trace system we've got, and much more knowledge about coronavirus. What we're planning on doing is making sure that should the situation deteriorate in the United Kingdom, that we would be able to repatriate any of those students who wanted to come back, but we would need also to be very careful in terms of the wider community. We've introduced a system whereby people can get a test on day 7 of isolation, and if that's negative, they can have a little bit more freedom. With students coming back over the Christmas period, we will have to look quite carefully at the situation in the United Kingdom to see whether that's applicable for them, because we'll be dealing with people not just travelling back, but who have been living in what may have been an area with quite a high prevalence of the virus. So we're working very closely with the Department of Health and Public Health Department to have contingency plans over the Christmas period to make sure that students, when they come back, are welcomed, that they can travel backwards and forwards, but also that they're kept safe and their families and communities are kept safe.
Is there a chance, do you think, Minister, that people would be asked not to come back?
That's a very good question. I hope not. But we're dealing with a situation which is extremely volatile at the moment, with increasing cases. I certainly don't want to tell people from the Isle of Man that they can't come home to see their families, but they will have to make that decision on a case-by-case basis, depending on where they are. I mean, we don't know whether the United Kingdom might go into a further lockdown later on in the year, where they won't be able to travel, and we were faced that earlier on this year. But certainly we will do as much as we can as a government to make sure that they are welcome to come back and they are kept safe.
Is there a chance? Can you imagine asking students to pay £1,000 and stay in the Comus Hotel for 14 days?
Again, that's an interesting question, because different jurisdictions have worked around quarantine in different ways. Using the Comus Hotel at the start of this pandemic was a practical way of trying to deal with the uncertainty at the time. And actually students and people who couldn't afford the fees of the Comus didn't have to pay for those. Other jurisdictions like New Zealand and Australia are still putting people into hotels when they come back. Now, I don't think we're facing that at the moment, but certainly if we needed to keep people safe when they came back to the island, if, for instance, they couldn't self-quarantine in their homes because perhaps their parents or one of their family members was in a vulnerable group and didn't feel able to do that, then we would make provision so that they could be accommodated somewhere else.
Can we infer from that the sort of obligatory residential quarantine was almost means tested about the way that it was paid for?
When we were facing repatriating Isle of Man residents in March, we needed to do it as safely as possible, because at the time we didn't know what the prevalence was in the United Kingdom, and also we hadn't got the testing track and trace system up and running on the island. We were still sending swabs over to Birmingham to be processed and getting the results 3 or 4 days later. We now have testing same day done on the Isle of Man. What we tried to do was to try to keep the community safe and put people in quarantine. And it wasn't means tested. What we tried to do is make sure that everyone was looked after. Those people who could afford it paid towards it. Those people who couldn't afford it were accommodated.
For those 7-day tests, I think I'm right in thinking returning residents have to pay £50 for that. So does the same logic apply to that?
In terms of students, yes. I mean, this is a contribution people are being asked to make to keep the system going, and make sure that we have a reliable and sustainable track and trace system. The Isle of Man government and Department of Health and Social Care have put a lot of investment into buying equipment so that we can be self-sufficient in testing. And through all the studies around the world, if you want to try to cope with the virus, particularly in a small community, you need to have absolute testing systems which are reliable, safe and quick, but you also need that track and trace, that when you do get somebody with a positive test, you can close that infection down very quickly. And we've seen that only in the last few weeks with some of the people who unfortunately and unwittingly have brought the virus back to our island.
I think this is probably a question for you, Kat, and we've touched on this a bit already. Do some of these uncertainties put people off going, do you think? Are there people who are staying or deferring as a result?
There are people who, like the Minister said earlier, have chosen not to return to the UK because everything's online, they can stay on the island. I think that the position we're in, it hasn't yet deterred people, not on a mass scale, but I think over the course of the next year we will see a shift in applications to higher education, whether they be on island or off, whether people go for open university, because this really is the first trial year of how universities are going to cope, how the island can cope in repatriating students. This is the guinea pig year, unfortunately. So I think we will see the major effects in about 12 months' time.